The handcuffs clicked shut before she could finish her sentence. One moment Talia Brooks was standing on the shoulder of a lonely Georgia highway in the blazing summer heat, composed, polite, doing everything right. The next, cold metal was biting into her wrists, a smirking officer was shoving her toward a patrol car, and everything she had worked for her entire life felt like it was being ripped away in a single afternoon. She had not been speeding. She had not run a light. She had done absolutely nothing wrong. But none of that seemed to matter to Sergeant Kyle Mercer, who stood there holding a small plastic bag of white powder with a smile that told her he had already decided how this story was going to end. What Mercer did not know was that this story had already been written, and he was not going to like how it ended. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on that highway and what happened in the days that followed, you need to understand who Talia Brooks really was. Because Mercer saw a young black woman in an expensive SUV and thought he saw an easy target, he could not have been more wrong. Talia Brooks was 22 years old, a second-year law student at one of Georgia's most respected universities, and the kind of person who had been quietly outworking everyone around her since the day she learned how the world actually operated. She had grown up in a working-class family in Atlanta, the daughter of a retired schoolteacher and a mechanic who told her every single day that the way she carried herself would determine how the world received her. So she carried herself with precision. She spoke with measured calm. She never raised her voice when composure would do more damage. She had learned early that in rooms where people looked at her and already made up their minds, the most powerful thing she could do was refuse to perform the reaction they expected. She was also married to Commander Marcus Brooks, but we will get to him in a moment. What you need to know right now is that on that particular Tuesday afternoon, Talia was driving back from campus after completing her constitutional law exam. She had stayed 3 hours longer than most of her classmates, going back through every answer twice, because that was the kind of student she was. She was tired, satisfied, and looking forward to getting home. She had the air conditioning set to 68 degrees, a bottle of water in the cup holder, and her phone mounted on the dashboard connected to a hands-free call. "You need to stop doing that," the voice on the other end said. Low, warm, carrying the weight of a man who spent most of his life in environments where saying the wrong thing got people killed. Even over a phone connection crossing thousands of miles, Marcus Brooks sounded like someone you did not want to disappoint. "Doing what?" Talia asked, genuinely amused. "Studying after everyone else has left. You're going to burn yourself out before the semester's even finished," says the man who hasn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. A pause, then a quiet laugh. "That's different, that's my job." "And this is mine," she said. "How are things over there?" "Can't say much, you know how it is." "I know exactly how it is, which is why I didn't ask for details." She smiled at the road ahead. "Just tell me you're being careful." "Always." "That's not reassuring, Marcus. You don't actually know what careful means." Another laugh. She could hear something in the background, muffled voices, equipment being moved. He was in the middle of something. He was always in the middle of something. "I have to go in a few minutes," he said. "Drive safe, I mean it." "I will." "Talia." "Hello." "I love you." "I love you too. Go do whatever terrifying thing you're about to go do." The call ended. The highway stretched out ahead of her, quiet and sun-baked. She was maybe 20 minutes from home when she saw it in the rearview mirror. Red and blue lights, sharp and immediate. She checked the speedometer. 53 miles per hour in a 55 zone. She had not drifted. She had not swerved. Her registration was current. Her insurance was paid. She was, in every measurable way, doing exactly what a driver was supposed to do. Still, she pulled over calmly. Hazard lights on. Both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. She already knew the rules of a traffic stop were different for someone who looked like her. She watched in the side mirror as the patrol car door opened. Sergeant Kyle Mercer stepped out, broad-shouldered, with the kind of slow, deliberate walk that men adopt when they want you to feel their authority before they open their mouths. He circled the SUV once, eyes moving over the vehicle with calculation. She could see the shift in his expression the moment he registered the quality of what he was looking at. The matte black armored exterior, the custom trim, the plates. Something moved across his face that looked very much like a decision being made. "License and registration," he said flatly when he reached her window. No greeting, no explanation. She handed both over without a word. "You know why I stopped you?" "I'm not sure," she said evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I don't believe I made any moving violations. I clocked you swerving, driving erratically." She did not flinch. "I don't believe that's accurate, sir, but I understand you have a job to do." He stared at her. That look, she recognized it immediately. It was the look of a man who expected nervousness or defiance and got neither. What he got instead was a young woman looking at him with calm, clear eyes and not giving him a single thing to work with. And that, it turned out, made him angrier than anything else she could have done. "Step out of the vehicle for me." She stepped out. Slacks, blouse, natural hair pulled back, posture exactly as it had always been. Straight, composed, unhurried. She stood near the front of the SUV and waited while Mercer moved toward the driver's side door. "I'd like to know if you have probable cause for a search," she said calmly. Mercer turned slowly and looked at her. "I don't need your permission." And that was when a second patrol car quietly pulled up behind Mercer's cruiser. If you are new to this channel, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because stories like this one are exactly what we cover here. Stay with this one. You need to see how it ends. The officer who stepped out of the second vehicle was younger, early 20s. His name was Dylan Carter, and he had been on the force for exactly 4 months. He stood back near his cruiser, watching the interaction with an expression that was difficult to read. Something about the scene made him uneasy, though he could not yet put words to it. Mercer had already turned back to the SUV. He pulled the door open and began moving through the interior with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Talia stood still near the patrol car, watching, keeping her breathing steady, reminding herself of every legal principle she had studied. She was building a mental record of everything happening in real time. Then Mercer went quiet. A beat passed, then another. "Well, well," he said slowly. He straightened up and turned around. In his hand was a small, clear plastic bag containing a white powdery substance. He held it up between 2 fingers like a trophy, and the smile that spread across his face was the smile of a man who believed he had just won something. "Look what I just found in your car." Talia stared at the bag. Her mind went completely still for 1 full second before it began moving faster than it ever had. She knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never touched an illegal substance in her life, that bag did not come from her vehicle. She knew it the way she knew her own name. "That is not mine," she said. "That's what they all say." "Sergeant, I am a law student. I have never possessed a controlled substance in my life. Whatever that is, it did not come from my vehicle." "You're under arrest," Mercer said, already moving toward her, "for possession of a controlled substance." She did not run. She did not scream. She stood exactly where she was and looked him directly in the eyes as he reached for his handcuffs. And in that moment, even as the cold metal clicked shut around her wrists, she made herself a quiet promise. "This is not over. This is just the beginning." What Talia did not know yet, and what Mercer certainly did not know, was that the moment he forced open that armored SUV's door, he had triggered something he had no framework for understanding. Embedded deep within the vehicle's security system was a silent emergency beacon, the kind installed specifically for military family vehicles tied to active deployment assignments. The moment unauthorized access was detected, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It called for help. Thousands of miles away, in a classified military operations center located somewhere that does not appear on any public map, Commander Marcus Brooks was standing over a steel table covered in mission briefings. The room around him was cold, artificially lit, and humming with the quiet intensity of people who understood that every decision made inside those walls had consequences that rippled outward in ways civilians would never fully understand. Marcus was not a large man in the way that people sometimes expect from soldiers. He was built precisely, efficiently, the way things are built when every unnecessary element has been stripped away over years of operating in environments that punish excess. He stood 6 feet tall with a stillness about him that his unit had learned to pay close attention to. When Marcus Brooks went still, something was being calculated. And when Marcus Brooks finished calculating, things happened very quickly. He had earned his rank through 15 years of Special Operations service, the last 7 with Delta Force, the United States Army's most elite and most secretive counterterrorism unit. His file, the portions that were not classified beyond the reach of standard military review, described a man with an almost unnatural ability to assess threats, construct responses, and execute with a precision that had made him one of the most requested commanders in joint operations across 3 different continents. His own unit called him Quiet Storm behind his back, though never to his face. Not because they feared him exactly, but because they respected the name too much to make it casual. The briefing in front of him involved a surveillance operation that had been 18 months in the planning. 3 of his most trusted team members were crowded around the table with him. Major Adrian Cole, his tactical partner of 9 years, stood to his left, marking coordinates on a digital display with the focused energy of a man who had not stopped working since breakfast. On his right was Sergeant First Class Devin Price, who everyone called Brick, for reasons that became obvious the moment you met him. Across the table was Captain Lydia Marsh, the unit's intelligence analyst, whose ability to find patterns in seemingly unrelated data had saved their lives more times than any of them kept official count of. It was Lydia who noticed it first, not the alert itself, but the change in Marcus. She had worked alongside him long enough to know what his neutral expression looked like, and she knew the precise moment it shifted. Marcus's eyes had dropped to the secured tablet sitting at the corner of the table. A small notification had appeared on the screen. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of alert that most people would glance at and dismiss. Marcus did not dismiss it. He reached for the tablet without a word and opened the notification. The screen displayed a vehicle identification number, a GPS coordinate, a distress status indicator glowing amber, and a short audio fragment. His eyes moved across the data in under 3 seconds. Then the audio played automatically through the tablet's small speaker. The room was quiet enough that everyone at the table heard it clearly. A voice. Male. Smug. The words are slightly distorted by distance from the recording sensor, but unmistakably clear. Look what I just found in your car. Then the sharp, mechanical sound of handcuffs clicking shut. The room went very still. Marcus set the tablet down on the table slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam anything. He did not make any dramatic movement at all. He simply stood there for approximately 4 seconds, looking at the coordinates on the screen, and then he lifted his eyes to Adrian Cole with an expression that his unit had only seen a small number of times over nearly a decade of working together. Adrian had his laptop open before Marcus said a single word. Redwood Hollow, Georgia, Marcus said quietly. Police department, everything you can find, now. Already pulling it, Adrian said. Marcus picked up a secondary phone from the table, the kind with encryption layers that made it useless to anyone who did not have the corresponding keys, and stepped away from the table. The call he made lasted 40 seconds. When he came back, his expression had not changed, but the air around him had shifted in a way that Lydia would later describe as the moment a decision gets made that cannot be unmade. Wrap the briefing, he said to the group. We have a situation. Nobody asked questions. That was one of the things about working with Marcus Brooks. When he said there was a situation, there was a situation. The details would come when they needed to come. Adrian's fingers moved rapidly across his keyboard. Within minutes, he had accessed public records, department filing systems, and several databases that technically required authorization levels he may or may not have possessed in that exact moment. What came back on the screen made him stop typing and look up. "Marcus," he said carefully, "you need to see this." What the data showed was not the profile of a normal police department with isolated misconduct. It was something uglier and more deliberate than that. Over a period of 6 years, the Redwood Hollow Police Department had processed an unusually high number of vehicle seizures compared to departments of similar size in comparable Georgia counties. The vehicles seized skewed heavily toward late-model luxury and high-value automobiles. Impound records showed a pattern of those vehicles being transferred to private auction within weeks of seizure, through a single auction house located 40 miles outside of town, owned by a shell company whose registered agent shared a last name with someone on the department payroll. Evidence logs from drug-related arrests showed gaps, not occasional missing entries of the kind that appear through simple administrative error, but systematic gaps. Entries that should have existed simply did not. Charges that had been filed and then quietly dropped with no documented reason. Complaints from arrested individuals alleging planted evidence, filed and then buried without investigation 3 separate times over 4 years. And there was one more thing. 7 of the arrested individuals had filed civil rights complaints with the State Oversight Board. All 7 complaints had been reviewed by the same board member and dismissed at the preliminary stage, each time within 48 hours of filing, faster than any standard review process should have allowed. "Someone has been protecting them," Lydia said, reading over Adrian's shoulder. "More than protecting," Adrian said. "Someone has been running interference. This is organized." Marcus looked at the screen for a long moment. His wife was sitting in a holding cell in a police station that operated as the visible layer of what appeared to be a coordinated criminal enterprise. She had been put there by an officer who had done this before, more than once, with the backing of a system designed to make sure it never came apart. That system had never encountered Marcus Brooks before. "We're going to Redwood Hollow," he said. Brick looked up from across the table. "All of us." "Enough of us," Marcus said. He was already moving. Meanwhile, back in Redwood Hollow, Talia was sitting in a holding cell at the back of the police station, and she was doing the thing she always did when the world tried to knock her sideways. She was thinking. Not panicking, not crying, though the pressure behind her eyes told her that the tears were there, waiting for a moment when she could afford them. Right now she could not afford them. Right now she needed to be sharper than she had ever been. She ran through what she knew. The bag had not been in her vehicle. She was certain of that with every part of herself that understood certainty. Mercer had gone into the vehicle, moved out of her line of sight for a period of time, and emerged with the bag. She had noticed, even in the shock of the moment, that he had not called out to Carter before producing the evidence. He had not asked Carter to come and witness the discovery. He had simply appeared with it. That was not standard procedure. That was a performance designed for one audience only, and that audience was her. She was also thinking about the vehicle's security system. Marcus had explained it to her when he bought the SUV, the emergency beacon, the encrypted signal transmission, the audio capture capability. She had half-listened at the time, the way you half-listen to the person you love when they are explaining something technical, and you are more interested in the coffee going cold in your hand. But she remembered enough. She remembered that if the system detected unauthorized forced entry, it sent a signal. She remembered that the signal went somewhere specific. She remembered that Marcus had said, almost as an afterthought, "If anything ever happens and I'm reachable, I'll know." She had laughed at that. She was not laughing now. The question was whether the signal had gone through. The question was whether Marcus was somewhere he could receive it. The question was whether any of this was going to matter before someone in this building decided to make things worse. She heard footsteps in the hallway. The door to the holding area opened, and Mercer appeared on the other side of the bars, hands in his pockets. That same satisfied expression settled into his face like it lived there permanently. "How are you holding up, counselor?" he said, drawing the last word out slowly and mocking. She looked at him calmly. "I'd like to make a phone call." "You'll get your phone call." "I'd like to make it now." "I said you'll get it." He tilted his head. "You know what I think your problem is? People like you come up through school, get a little education, get a nice car, and start thinking the rules bend around you. That's not how it works out here." She did not respond to that. She held his gaze and said nothing, which she knew from experience was the response that bothered men like Mercer the most. He studied her for a moment. "That car's going to impound tonight, just so you know." She kept her expression perfectly neutral even as something inside her registered exactly what that meant. He was not just after her. He was after the vehicle. That was what this had always been about. Mercer left. The door closed. Talia sat back against the wall of the cell and let out a slow, controlled breath. On the other side of the building, in a small break room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, Officer Dylan Carter was sitting alone with his body camera footage playing on a laptop screen. He had watched the relevant section 4 times already. He was about to watch it a 5th. The footage showed Mercer approaching Talia's SUV. It showed him pulling the driver's door open. It showed his upper body disappearing into the vehicle's interior. And then, for a period of approximately 3 seconds, Mercer's right hand moved outside the camera's frame. When it came back into frame, the plastic bag was in it. 3 seconds. That was all it took. And Carter had watched it enough times now to know, with a certainty that sat in his stomach like a stone, exactly what those 3 seconds meant. He closed the laptop. He sat in the silence of the break room for a long time, staring at the wall, understanding that the next decision he made was going to define something about who he was for the rest of his life. He was still sitting there when the lights in the building flickered. The flicker lasted less than 2 seconds. Every screen in the building blinked, the dispatch radio cut to static for a moment, and then everything came back online as if nothing had happened. 2 officers at the front desk looked at each other and shrugged. The duty sergeant blamed the summer heat and the old building's tired electrical system. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody except Carter, who had been around military technology long enough during his brief training to recognize that what just happened had nothing to do with the building's wiring. Someone had just announced their presence. Outside in the parking lot, 4 black SUVs had pulled in without sirens, without lights, without any of the noise that announces arrival to people who are paying attention. They parked in a deliberate formation across the lot, engines cutting off in near-perfect unison. The men and women who stepped out moved with the particular economy of motion that separates people who have trained for years from people who have simply been given a uniform. They wore civilian clothes, no visible weapons. Nothing that would give a watching eye something obvious to focus on. But everything about the way they positioned themselves around the building's entry points communicated a language that had nothing to do with words. Leading them was a man in a dark jacket, hands loose at his sides, walking toward the front entrance of the Redwood Hollow Police Department with the calm, unhurried stride of someone who had already decided how this evening was going to go and simply needed the building to catch up. Commander Marcus Brooks pushed open the front door and walked inside. The officer at the front desk, a young woman named Carla who had been working the night shift for 6 months, looked up with the automatic expression of someone about to ask how she could help a visitor. The expression changed when she took in the full picture of the man standing in front of her. It was not that he looked threatening in any way she could immediately articulate. It was something else, something in the absolute stillness of him. The way the space around him seemed to organize itself slightly differently than normal. "Good evening," Marcus said. His voice was quiet and completely level. "My name is Commander Marcus Brooks, United States Army. My wife, Talia Brooks, was brought into this facility earlier today on charges I have reason to believe were fabricated. I am here to address that." Carla blinked. "Sir, I'm going to need to get a supervisor." "That would be appreciated," he said. "While you do that, I want you to know that there are federal investigators currently outside this building who have already been in contact with the district attorney's office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. This is not a confrontation. This is a courtesy visit before things become significantly more formal." He said it the way someone reads the weather forecast. Factual, dispassionate, absolute. Carla picked up the phone. Sergeant Kyle Mercer appeared from the back hallway 2 minutes later, still carrying himself with the authority of a man who owned every room he walked into. That confidence lasted exactly until he saw Marcus standing at the front desk, and even then it did not crumble immediately. Mercer was not the kind of man whose confidence crumbled easily. Instead, it shifted, hardened, became defensive in the way that guilty things become defensive when they suddenly understand they have been seen. "Who are you?" Mercer demanded, stopping in the middle of the room. "I already told your officer," Marcus said. "Commander Marcus Brooks. Talia Brooks is my wife." Mercer looked him over the way he had looked over Talia's vehicle on the highway, assessing, calculating. "Your wife is in custody on a narcotics possession charge. Whatever you think you're doing here, it's not going to change that." "I don't think you understand the situation you're in yet," Marcus said. "That's all right. You're about to." The front door opened behind Marcus and Adrian Cole walked in, carrying a laptop and a hard drive, followed by two federal investigators in plain clothes who produced credentials before Mercer could finish forming his next sentence. Behind them came Captain Lydia Marsh, who walked directly to an open table near the far wall, set down her equipment, and began connecting cables with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing in more hostile environments than a small-town Georgia police station. Mercer's jaw tightened. "You can't just walk in here and—" "The warrant was signed 40 minutes ago," one of the federal investigators said, placing a document on the front desk without looking up. "It covers all digital records, evidence logs, impound documentation, body camera footage, and financial records associated with this department going back 6 years. You are welcome to contact your legal representation. I would recommend doing so immediately." The room had filled up by now. Other officers on duty had drifted in from various parts of the building, drawn by the shift in atmosphere the way animals are drawn toward the edge of a clearing when something changes in the air. They stood in a loose cluster near the hallway, watching, unsure whether to intervene or stay still. Most of them chose still, which told Marcus something useful about who in this building had known what was happening and who had simply been present for it. Mercer had not moved from his spot in the middle of the room. His eyes were moving between Marcus, the federal agents, and the laptop Adrian had now opened on the table next to Lydia's station. His expression had completed its journey from authority through defensiveness and arrived somewhere that Marcus recognized as a man running calculations and finding that none of them were coming out in his favor. "I want a lawyer," Mercer said. "That is absolutely your right," the lead federal investigator said. "But before you say anything further, you should be aware that we already have enough." Adrian turned the laptop screen toward the room. What it displayed was not a single piece of evidence but a cascade of them, laid out in a clean, connected visual map that showed the full architecture of what had been happening inside the Redwood Hollow Police Department for the better part of 6 years. Bank account transfers, auction house records, impound logs cross-referenced against vehicle seizure reports, names connected to money connected to dates. It was the kind of display that worked not because any single element was overwhelming, but because the pattern was undeniable. When you saw it all together, there was only one explanation for what you were looking at. The room was very quiet. Then, from the hallway that led to the back of the building, a voice. "I need to say something." Everyone turned. Officer Dylan Carter was standing at the hallway entrance. Still in his uniform, his expression carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has been sitting alone with a decision for too long and has finally made it. He was holding his laptop against his chest with both arms, the way a person carries something they are about to hand over and cannot take back. "Dylan," Mercer said immediately, his voice dropping low with warning. Carter looked at Mercer for a long moment. Something passed between them in that look, the entire weight of what Carter had seen on that body camera footage, the 4 months of watching how things worked in this department, the break room and the burnt coffee, and the 5 times he had watched that 3-second clip and known exactly what it meant. "I watched the body camera footage from the traffic stop today," Carter said, addressing the federal investigators directly. "There is a period of approximately 3 seconds where Sergeant Mercer's hand moves outside the camera's frame. When it returns to frame, he is holding the plastic bag that was used as the basis for the arrest." He paused. "I do not believe that bag was in the vehicle before Sergeant Mercer entered it." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things permanently. Mercer moved, not toward the door, not toward Carter, but inward, pulling himself up with the last remaining instinct of a man who has spent decades believing that authority is its own protection. "That footage doesn't show anything," he said, and his voice had lost something it had carried all day. "You can't prove." "Play it," Marcus said quietly. Adrian looked at Carter, who nodded and opened his laptop. The footage appeared on the larger screen that Lydia had connected to her equipment. Every person in the room watched it play in silence. Mercer approaching the vehicle, the door opening, the upper body disappearing inside. 3 seconds, the hand returning to frame, the bag appearing between 2 fingers as if it had always been there. Nobody spoke. Then from a side door near the back of the room, Chief Randall Hodge walked in. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent a long career learning which corners could be cut and which needed to appear clean. He had clearly been watching from somewhere nearby, waiting to see which way the room fell before committing himself to a position. He looked at the screen. He looked at the federal investigators. He looked at Mercer. Then he looked at Marcus. "I think there may have been some procedural issues today that we need to address internally," Hodge said carefully, in the voice of a man trying to build an exit ramp in real time. Marcus turned to look at him fully for the first time, and something about that look made Hodge stop talking mid-sentence. "Chief Hodge," the lead federal investigator said, stepping forward with a second document. "We have a warrant for your arrest as well. Charges include racketeering, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. These charges relate to a pattern of conduct over a period of 6 years that your department records indicate you were aware of and actively facilitated." Hodge opened his mouth. "I'd save it for your attorney," the investigator said. The handcuffs that went onto Mercer's wrists were the same model he had used on Talia earlier that afternoon. Marcus noticed that. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. 2 officers stepped forward to process both Mercer and Hodge. Neither man resisted physically, though Mercer's face had moved through something that looked briefly like disbelief, before settling into a cold, contained fury that he aimed at no one in particular, because there was no single target for what he was feeling. He had picked a woman on the side of a road because she looked like someone who had no recourse. He had been wrong in a way that was going to cost him everything, and somewhere in the machinery of his expression, you could see the moment that understanding finally arrived. Marcus watched them be led away. Then he turned and walked down the hallway toward the back of the building without waiting for permission or escort. No one stopped him. The holding cell was the 3rd door on the left. The officer who had followed him back unlocked it without being asked, stepped aside, and found something very important to look at on the opposite wall. The door swung open. Talia was sitting on the bench at the back of the cell, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, looking exactly the way she had looked on the side of that highway. Like someone who had decided, at some point before any of this started, that no version of this was going to break her. She looked up when the door opened. She saw Marcus standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The distance between the doorway and the bench was maybe 8 feet, and it felt like the longest 8 feet in the world, charged with everything that had happened and everything that had almost happened, and everything that the day could have become if 100 small variables had been slightly different. Then Talia stood up, and the composure she had been holding for hours finally found its edge. Not breaking, just bending, the way things bend when the pressure is finally allowed to release. Her eyes filled, and she blinked it back with the fierce precision of someone who refuses to fully surrender even in relief. Marcus crossed the cell in 3 steps and put his arms around her. She let him, just for a moment, just long enough to remember what solid ground felt like. "I knew the beacon would work," she said quietly into his shoulder. "I told you it would. I was also terrified the whole time." "I know." She pulled back and looked at him, composing herself with visible effort, squaring her shoulders back to where they belonged. "Are they in custody?" "Both of them." Carter came forward. Marcus looked at her. "How did you know about Carter?" "I was paying attention," she said simply. "He watched that stop like someone who wasn't sure what he was seeing. I figured if he watched the footage he'd know." She glanced toward the hallway. "He's going to need protection. Whistleblowing in a department like this doesn't come without consequences." Marcus almost smiled. His wife had been in a holding cell for hours, facing fabricated charges, and her first complete thought upon being released was about the safety of the rookie officer who had helped expose the system that put her there. "Already being handled," he said. She nodded. Then she straightened her blouse, ran one hand over her hair, and walked out of the holding cell ahead of him. If you have been watching this story and feeling every moment of it, drop a comment below and tell us what you were thinking when that cell door opened. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because the final chapter of this story, what happened in the courtroom, what Talia did next, and the moment that brought down the entire corrupt network for good, is coming up, and you do not want to miss a single word of it. The weeks that followed moved with the particular momentum of things that have been held underground too long and finally broken the surface. What started as a single traffic stop on a quiet Georgia highway became, within 72 hours of that night at the police station, the subject of a federal investigation that reached further than even Marcus and his team had initially mapped. Because Mercer and Hodge were not alone, they never had been. As Adrian and Lydia continued pulling threads from the department's financial and operational records, the picture that assembled itself was one of deliberate, layered corruption that had been carefully constructed over years to look like nothing from the outside. The auction house connected to the shell company, connected to 3 private investors, 2 of whom had direct financial relationships with members of the county government. The board member who had dismissed 7 civil rights complaints in 48 hours each time turned out to have received payments routed through a consulting firm that existed only on paper. The pattern was not chaotic. It was architectural. Someone had built this thing with patience and intelligence, and it had been running without serious interruption for 6 years, because the people positioned to stop it were either involved in it or too afraid to move against it. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation formally took over the case within 4 days. By the end of the first week, 11 people had been charged across 4 different agencies and offices. By the end of the second week, the story had traveled beyond Georgia entirely and was being covered by national news outlets who sent reporters to Redwood Hollow to stand on the highway where it all began and describe to their audiences what a small town looks like when its institutional rot finally gets pulled into the light. Other victims came forward. They had been waiting, most of them, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the belief that coming forward would change anything. That belief had shifted. When people saw what happened when Talia Brooks was targeted, when they saw the speed and the precision with which the response had dismantled something that had survived for 6 years, something changed in the calculus of possibility. A woman called in from 3 states away to describe a traffic stop in Redwood Hollow 4 years earlier that had cost her a car and a clean record. A man came forward, whose brother had spent 8 months in county jail on a planted possession charge, before the case was quietly dropped with no explanation and no apology. A family described losing their vehicle, a van used to run a small catering business, to an impound action triggered by a stop in which they maintained, consistently and in detail, that they had done nothing wrong. Every account fit the pattern. Every account added weight to what was already an overwhelming body of evidence. Every account put another brick in the wall that was going to come down on the people who had built this system. Talia was present for all of it, not as a victim seeking resolution, though she was certainly that. She was present as something more active. She had begun working directly with the federal prosecution team in an advisory capacity, an arrangement that was unusual for someone who had not yet completed her law degree, but that the lead prosecutor, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Renee Caldwell, had pushed for specifically because of what she described in internal memos as Talia's exceptional analytical clarity and her first-hand understanding of the department's tactics. Talia sat in rooms where strategy was built. She reviewed evidence. She identified inconsistencies in records that trained investigators had passed over. She was, in the quiet and determined way that had always defined her, making herself indispensable. Marcus stayed as long as his assignment allowed, which was not as long as either of them wanted. The classified operation that had been interrupted by that alert on his tablet could not wait indefinitely, and both of them understood the terms of the life they had chosen together. The morning he left, they sat in the kitchen of their home while the sun was still low and orange through the windows, drinking coffee and not talking much, the way people do when saying more would only make the leaving harder. "You're going to be all right," he said. It was not a question. "I was all right the whole time," she said. "You know that." "I do." He looked at her across the table. "That's one of the things that keeps me going when I'm out there, knowing that you don't actually need me to fix things. You just need me to show up." She reached across and put her hand over his. "Showing up matters more than you think." He left an hour later. She stood on the porch and watched the car until it turned the corner and disappeared, and then she went back inside and opened her laptop and went back to work. The trial of Sergeant Kyle Mercer began 4 months after the arrest. It was, by any legal standard, a comprehensive and methodical dismantling of a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable. Assistant U.S. Attorney Caldwell presented the case with the kind of relentless precision that left no oxygen for reasonable doubt. The body camera footage was played for the jury. The 3-second clip that Carter had watched 5 times alone in a break room was now watched by 12 jurors in a federal courtroom. And the silence in that room when the footage finished was the silence of people who have seen something and cannot unsee it. Carter testified for 2 full days. He was calm and specific and utterly credible, the kind of witness who does not perform conviction but simply carries it, answering every question with the plain directness of someone who has made their peace with the cost of telling the truth and is no longer afraid of it. Defense attorneys attempted to characterize him as a disgruntled junior officer with a personal grievance and an overactive imagination. Carter looked at them from the witness stand with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he had seen on that footage, and knew the jury knew it too, and the attempt collapsed under its own weight. Financial experts walked the jury through the money. 6 years of transfers, auction records, shell company structures, and coordinated dismissals of complaints laid out in precise sequential order. The defense argued complexity and coincidence. The prosecution argued that coincidence does not maintain a consistent pattern across 6 years and 11 participants. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Mercer's attorneys made one last significant attempt during closing arguments. They painted him as a dedicated officer with a record of service who had made, at worst, a single error in judgment during a high-pressure traffic stop. They asked the jury to consider his years on the force, his family, his community ties. They asked for mercy. Talia sat in the gallery during closing arguments. She listened to the defense characterize the woman her client had handcuffed on the side of a highway as a peripheral figure in a story that was really about a good man's unfortunate mistake. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression exactly as it had been on that highway, composed, present, refusing to perform the reaction anyone expected from her. Several jurors glanced at her during the defense's closing. She did not look away from any of them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Mercer received 31 years in federal prison for racketeering, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Chief Randall Hodge, whose trial concluded 3 weeks later, received 24 years for his role in orchestrating and protecting the scheme. Of the 11 people charged across the broader investigation, 9 were convicted. The 2 remaining cases were still pending at the time of sentencing, with prosecutors expressing confidence about the outcomes. The auction house was shut down. The shell company was dissolved. The county officials connected to the financial network resigned or were removed from office. The board member who had dismissed the civil rights complaints was charged separately with obstruction and abuse of office. Redwood Hollow spent the following year under federal oversight, with an independent monitor reviewing every arrest, every impound action, and every evidence log generated by the rebuilt department. Officer Dylan Carter was placed under a formal protection arrangement during the trial period and received a commendation from the U.S. Attorney's Office for his testimony. He transferred to a different department 6 months after sentencing, one with a reputation he had researched carefully before accepting the position, and continued his career as a police officer. He said in the single interview he gave after the trial that he had not done anything heroic. He had simply watched a video and told the truth about what he saw. He said he hoped it had not taken him too long to do it. Talia finished law school 8 months after the trial concluded. On the morning of her graduation, she stood in front of a mirror in her apartment adjusting her cap and gown, and she thought about the highway. She thought about the moment the red and blue lights had appeared in her rearview mirror, and the way her stomach had gone quiet and careful. She thought about the handcuffs. She thought about the holding cell and the sound of Mercer's footsteps in the hallway, and the hours she had spent sitting on that bench, building a mental record of everything that was happening and refusing to let fear eat the parts of her that she would need later. She thought about how close it had come to going differently, if the beacon had not triggered, if Carter had closed the laptop after the 4th viewing instead of the 5th, if Marcus had been in a location where the signal could not reach, if any one of 100 variables had bent slightly in another direction, she might have been processed through a system designed to grind people down until they accepted outcomes they should never have accepted, and nobody would have been the wiser. She thought about everyone it had gone differently for. The woman 3 states away, the man's brother who spent 8 months in county jail, the family whose catering van was taken, the 7 people whose complaints were dismissed in 48 hours by a man on someone's payroll, all the people who had stood on the same highway, faced the same system, and had nobody show up. That was the part she could not put down. That was the part that had been rearranging something inside her since the night Marcus walked through that holding cell door. Not the injustice done to her specifically, though that was real and it mattered, but the vast, patient machinery of it. The way it had been designed to target people who were assumed to have no recourse, and the way it had worked, again and again, on people who deserved so much better than what they got. She was going to spend her career making that machinery uncomfortable. At the graduation ceremony that afternoon, when it came time for the student address, Talia walked to the podium in the warm Georgia sunlight in front of several hundred people and spoke without notes. She talked about the law not as an abstraction, but as a living instrument that cuts differently depending on who is holding it, and about the responsibility of everyone in that audience who was about to be licensed to hold it. She talked about the gap between what the law says and what the law does, and about the specific, daily, unglamorous work of closing that gap. She did not tell the full story of what had happened to her, not there, not in that format. But those who knew, knew. And those who did not know could feel in the quality of her conviction that she was not speaking theoretically. She talked about the people who never get a beacon, who never get the cell door opened, who sit in systems designed to outlast them and have to find the strength to keep going without anyone showing up. She said that the most important thing any of them could do with the credential they were about to receive was to remember that the law belongs to those people too, whether the law currently acts like it or not. When she finished, the applause started before she had fully stepped back from the microphone. In the audience, Marcus Brooks sat in a folding chair in the third row, still and composed as always, watching his wife at the podium. He was in civilian clothes, his posture betraying nothing of what he was or what he had done or the distances he regularly crossed between the world most people lived in and the one he operated inside of. He looked like a man attending his wife's graduation, which was exactly what he was. When she found him afterward in the crowd, he was already looking at her. She walked up to him, and they stood together for a moment in the noise and movement of the celebration around them, and something passed between them that needed no translation. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. "How was the speech?" "Honest," he said, "which is the only thing worth being." She nodded. Then she looked past the crowd toward where the other graduates were gathering for photographs, and her expression carried the particular forward-facing quality of someone who has closed one chapter and is already thinking about the next one. Kyle Mercer had stood on a Georgia highway and looked at a young black woman in an expensive vehicle and decided she was someone he could use. He had decided, in the practiced and arrogant shorthand of a man who had done it before, that she had no one, no protection, no recourse, no one who would come. He had made that calculation in the time it took him to circle an SUV, and he had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. He had not known about the beacon. He had not known about the encrypted signal. He had not known about the man thousands of miles away who would receive that signal and move with the quiet, unstoppable precision of someone for whom the word obstacle is purely descriptive and never final. He had not known that the woman he was handcuffing on the side of the road had already survived harder things than him and had been building herself, deliberately and patiently, into someone equipped to fight the exact kind of battle he had just started. He had seen an easy target. He had found the wrong woman. And in doing so, he had not just ended his own career and freedom, and the criminal enterprise he had spent 6 years constructing. He had handed Talia Brooks the case that would define the opening years of her legal career, the story that would make her name known in civil rights circles before she had passed a single bar exam, and the deepest possible confirmation of everything she had always known about why the work she was about to dedicate her life to was not optional. It was necessary. It was urgent, and she was ready. Some mistakes cannot be undone. Mercer's was one of them. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please leave a comment below and tell us what moment hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe right now because every single week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about people who refuse to be counted out. Stories about systems that believed they were untouchable until they weren't. Stories that remind you that the right person in the right moment, with the right refusal to give up, can change everything.